For me, purpose is really understanding how do we get people to not look at disruption from exactly like turbulence, a negative lens, but actually say, can we turn it into opportunity?
Hi, and welcome to the LeadUP Podcast. I'm Lennox Wasara, host of the show. I get to speak to alumni from the University of Pretoria who are trailblazers, trendsetters, and shapeshifters in their own right. Today, I'm joined by Abdullah Verachia, who is an incredible entrepreneur, innovator, sought-out global speaker, and academic. He's been able to start a business called the Strategists, which he's CEO of, where he's managed to work with companies and governments around the world. As a sought-out speaker, he's spoken in over 60 cities, and his keynote messaging certainly resonating with many listeners across the world. Presently, he is a senior member of faculty at the Gibbs Business School, and where he's also been awarded multiple awards for excellence in teaching. He joins me today on the LeadUP Podcast to share more about his incredible story. Abdullah, welcome to the show. I was actually thinking about all the things you're doing. It's so much. It requires a lot of capacity, but a lot of energy and a lot of grit. And I was thinking that, if you were to be a car, you would have to have like a V12 engine because there's just so much to do. But, what really fuels you?
Thanks, Leonard. I think I actually love the car analogy. I love cars.
Yeah.
I actually have an interest in a number of motor dealerships, and maybe that speaks to a lot of the context. It's the ability to fuel. And I often say that success is never individual. It's really based on the various types of individuals that you have around me. So I look after faculty for strategy, sustainability, and marketing at Gibbs. But actually, it's not about the person who heads up the faculty in that unit. It's all of the faculty that actually make Gibbs such a phenomenal business school. It's the administrative team that comes together. It's the executive team. And it's the same with really how we think about successful organizations. It's never an individual. It's a collection of various individuals that in concert come together. And in that concert really create the magic that comes together. So I don't think it's about me. I think it's about the people that we work together with, the people that we really bring together in terms of the energy that fuels the success of organizations or even the success behind individuals.
It is interesting that you credit a lot of people for your success and to be able to have done what you're doing. But, you must have built a lot of grit and resilience to stay the course.
I think a lot of, who we are as individuals, and I talk to so many of my clients, so many of my students in the classroom, is actually as a result of where you've come from. And so maybe let's go back. I grew up in Mpumalanga. I grew up in Witbank, the coal city. And I had the privilege back in the day, I'll never forget, a principal of mine in a leadership camp in the bush in the middle of nowhere, coming to us and saying, would any of you be interested in participating in a Model United Nations debating competition? We had no debating at school. I never knew I could speak in public. And I then said, I want to miss a day of school. So I picked up my hand to miss a day of school. Yeah. And that fundamentally actually changed the trajectory of my life in terms of what I ended up doing, the people I associated with. That program, in effect, took 12 of us from thousands of kids to New York City. And that was the first flight I ever went on in my life, from a coal mining town in Mpumalanga to one of the biggest cities in the world. And it actually opens your eyes. I then went on to study law, right? I became a lawyer, hated it. People often ask me, why did you study law? I said to my daughter the other night that I studied law because it looked fancy on TV. The suits were great. The coffee looked very good. And it was an attractive proposition. But when I actually went into the legal industry, I realized this isn't for me. And then fundamentally changed course, right? I went into strategy and really happened to be at the right space at the right time, doing the right things. And then you're right, it does come down to grit, determination, making things happen.
Interesting, because you must have had the honesty to tell yourself, listen, I'm not really enjoying this. Because I think a lot of people get stuck in something and they're quite not enjoying it, or their heart longs for something else. But you were able to actually have that conversation with yourself and to pivot.
Look, it's a hard conversation, right? I'll never forget going back to Model UN, right? I went to the tutor who actually took me 6 years before to New York. And I went to her and I said, look, I'm in a conundrum. I have studied this path. My parents have gone out to the whole community where I live and say that my son's a lawyer. And now the last thing I want to do is go to them and actually say I don't want to be a lawyer anymore, right? The suits are not that cool after I've worn a tie for my entire Canada attorney period. And so he gave me a piece of advice. He said, look, why don't you consider some options and see what fuels your passion? And for me, a lot of that it does come down to who do you surround yourself with? Who are the people that you can have very honest conversations with and that perhaps can give you the confidence to be able to use your language, pivot in terms of a career, in terms of what you do. But in effect, and this is important, what I do for a living is help companies navigate a very disruptive world. And so part of this is actually sitting with the board or an exco of a company and getting them to think about what's happening in the environment we're operating in. The environment is turbulent and will continue to be turbulent. Many people thought that COVID was the big disruptor. Well, actually, COVID was one disruptor in a healthcare environment that, yes, affected the entire world, but we continue to face disruption, right?
Yeah.
One example I often use is that the population in the world in 1960 was about 2.8 billion people. The population today is just under 8.5 billion people. What does that mean? It means that in 60 years, we've gone 3.5x in terms of the population. What that creates is massive tension between countries. And that's one of the big causal factors in terms of the geopolitical tension amongst countries. That's a big factor in terms of the economic tension that we see between countries. I often say, translate economic data into your personal life. I have 3 kids, myself and my wife. If I take the 5 of us and I times it by 3.5, we're now 18.5 people at home.
Yeah.
It means I have to go with 2 minibus taxis and a Mini Cooper to an Indian wedding.
Yeah.
It means that I've got to buy a much bigger home, which I can't afford with the resources that I have. It means that we can't go to the holidays we go to. That's what's happened in the world. In 60 years, we've gone 3.5x without increasing the amount of water, the amount of energy, the amount of resources. And so that creates tension. So the point is that I help companies think about how do they proactively adapt to all of the disruption that's happening around us.
So you made these observations, and there's a lot of research that goes behind a lot of your observations as well. When it comes to the other side, to the side of proposing a solution, I know it's complex, it's very hard to find one because there are many moving parts to what you describe. But what is your overall feeling around what could actually be the way forward to solve some of the problems that you mentioned now?
Yeah, so one of the things that often we see as human beings is we see turbulence from a negative lens. We see turbulence as the fact that there might be a tension between 2 countries. We see turbulence as the fact that perhaps we're not as digitally enabled as a company and we're struggling to compete because we've got new companies who've come in. But turbulence actually creates opportunity. Peter Drucker beautifully puts it. He says the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It's the inability to act with new logic. And so my role and the role of the various teams who work with me in helping companies think about how do they respond strategically is not to have the answers, but to be able to get companies to think about how might we respond to disruptive forces that we're facing. And these disruptive forces could be macro, they could be political, economic, socio-economic, they could be meso, right? They could be our company, our competitive space, our clients, the shifting landscape, the affordability of our clients, or they could even be micro. Do we have the skills in our organization, in our leadership team, to be able to respond to some of the changes that we see in the world? So back to, the word that you used, pivoting. Yeah. Pivoting happens all the time, right? We're constantly thinking about how do we respond to a set of circumstances that we faced, and what is the best way to be able to respond at a given time.
A lot of your work talks about disruption amplified, looking at Reset, Rewire, and Reimagine Everything, a book that you wrote. What was the key message you wanted the reader to get out there? Because I think you wanted them to take an action as well.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of the times when I work with clients, and even in the book, I use what we call an escaped framework. It's not the work of Thabo Bester, just to clarify that. And what I use in this escaped framework is actually to think methodically as to how do organizations and individuals respond to what's happening in terms of the market that they're operating in. So the E of the escape framework talks about the external environment. Not because it's nice to talk about, not because it's great as a water cooler conversation, but because the environment matters in terms of where we operate. It matters in terms of the affordability of goods and services. It matters in terms of the size of the market that you're operating in. It matters because it gives us the ability to say, where do we want to operate as individuals or organizations? And so the environment then opens up the S, which is the spaces, right? Where are we going to play as an organization? How will we win? With what type of activities and choices that we're going to take, will we be able to operate in that market? And it has to be related to the environment. I often speak to a number of my students at class at Gibbs, and I say that perhaps what worked in 1997 and was a fantastic competitive strategy might not work in 2024 because so much of the environment has shifted. And so we must link the environment to the spaces that we're operating in. The C of the ESCAPE framework talks about capabilities, right? It's nice to say that that's what the environment looks like. It's nice to say that's where we're going to play. Do we have the capabilities? What are the characteristics that make us unique and differentiated to be able to operate in that environment? And so part of how I wrote the book was really to be able to follow this methodical approach in terms of what does the canvas we're painting on, the environment, look like? If that's the canvas we're painting on, what are the sets of colors that we actually use to paint on that canvas, or maybe the combination of colors? And then very importantly, back to your original question, what are the skills that we need? And so this issue of me being very active in disruption causes issues for me. So my wife was at school the other day dropping our kids off, and somebody stopped her and said, "Is your husband the disruptor?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "I'm not the disruptor." But yes, I do talk a lot around disruption because I think for me, purpose is really understanding how do we get people to not look at disruption from exactly like turbulence, a negative lens, but actually say, can we turn it into opportunity? And maybe let's look at COVID, right? A major disruptor. COVID created spaces for organizations to respond and actually to craft different value propositions. So think about the pervasive influence of digital e-commerce as a result of COVID. Think about the fact that we all of a sudden found that hybrid working is possible and plausible and actually realistic. Think about the fact that all of a sudden we started to look at how do we manage businesses in a much more operationally effective way. And so part of what I try and do is to get individuals and organizations to think about how do we turn disruption into opportunity. So what are some of the skills that we need that I think have become sacrosanct in the world that we're moving into? One, I think, sense making. This ability to have better ability to sense make what's going on around us and to use that sense making and to translate it into, so what does it mean for my firm, my organization, my business unit, me as an individual, and to take that translation into opportunity. So that's a lot of how I see this in terms of the skills that we need.
Yeah, you wouldn't have been able to get this far without great success. You've been very successful as the CEO of the Strategists. I like the fact that you mentioned disruption brings a lot of panic. I think about it as being on a plane, the turbulence comes, there's also a bit of panic there. So, as CEO, you can't panic at all. You really have to be composed, but also honest with your staff and your clients, because I do think that there's an expectation that your strategies will solve all their problems, right? So I just wonder what's worked for you, what's allowed you to be so successful.
So there's three things that we do particularly well as an organization. The one is we help companies build competitive strategy, but I often say that I'm not going to bring a team in that will design a strategy and put it as a fait accompli. Actually, what we do is we facilitate the thinking process that leaders in an organization actually design their strategy. We'll come with a process, we'll come with a provocative thinking, we'll push in a direction, we'll facilitate the thinking process that actually the leaders who are on the battlefield running their organizations are those that are designing their strategy. And so that's one that's been a hallmark. I always say to my clients that I'm not a consulting firm that's going to come here and give you a piece of paper or a 500 deck PowerPoint that I've designed in a dark room. I think that's insincere. I think a big element is how do I actually curate a process where I leverage the collective expertise. The second thing that we do as part of the Strategists is we run a company called Bespoke Immersions. We take executives from one market into many markets across the world. And so we take individuals from Silicon Valley to London to Beijing to Accra to Ghana to Nigeria to India to China. And the idea is really how do we look at the world as a university of ideas, of thinking, because I am a firm believer that there is a necessity for us to think about the intersection of learning, to think about cross-cultural learning, and to be able to learn from other industries. What do I mean? At Gibbs, we've just launched a program with La Liga, the football league.
Yeah.
And I say there's one of the best industries to learn from is the entertainment and sporting industry. If you think about it, right? Sporting clubs every weekend are beaming out to billions of people. Sporting clubs are looking at marketing and branding and advertising. Strategy happens on the football field all the time. Millions of decisions taken by football players or cricket players, etc. And so I am a firm believer in this intersection of learning. How do we, look at an industry like the music industry or the entertainment industry or the sporting industry and actually apply it into other industries? The second one is how do we take leaders into unconventional or different environments?
Right.
How do we take leaders from the US to go into the largest democracy in the world in India and understand how are they solving for some of their socio-economic dynamics? So that's been a big element in terms of how we help companies navigate the world we're living in.
Yeah, interesting that you spoke about the lessons you're learning from these high entertainment environments, such as sporting spaces. Are they always transferable, the lessons, or you're looking at the principles? Because I do think that there might be contextual differences in some areas. So how do you make sure that it does translate?
That's the very important question, right? And I think that's what we spend quite a bit of time on as academics in this field is where do we look at the transferability? How do we look at the integration of learning? How do we take the experiences from one industry and look at the translation or application into another industry? And so without a doubt, there definitely are similarities, but there are also differences. And part of our responsibility is to be able to demonstrate where those similarities or differences are, but also to be able to sometimes look at how we can pull out the light bulbs, right? I love in my day-to-day work in helping companies build strategy to actually understand where some of these light bulbs are. I love sitting in a classroom with MBA students and facilitating a debate and a dialogue. I think the days of faculty members standing for 3 hours and lecturing on end is gone, right?
And it's incredibly boring.
Yeah, 100%, right? You think back to our undergrad days. But I think that a lot of faculty are starting to think about how do we create classroom experiences that look at the academic practice, that looks at facilitating learning, that looks at how do we embed this learning in ways that actually speak to the context of where people are.
Do you enjoy playing in different spaces, academia, practice, as an author as well? You get to interact with many people who are also very smart. What kind of things are you learning through all this? Like, is there some stuff as I'm speaking that comes to mind where, I didn't really think I would experience this when I started doing this work, but wow, the last couple of years or the last 10 years, I've really gotten a grasp of this and it's tested and proven to be something that is true.
Every single day, and I genuinely mean this, is fun, right? Because every day I learn a huge amount, right? Because part of the work that I do, and you speak about the various activities, I actually think it's a virtuous cycle. They feed off each other, right?
Yeah.
I think if you sit on boards of companies or you're helping companies build strategy, you can translate what you're hearing and seeing into the classroom environment. What you're doing in terms of researching from an academic perspective. So my PhD currently is in the area of turbulence and dynamic capabilities. I find that the depth that you need to go through in terms of reading towards a PhD adds so much more value in terms of how you teach in the classroom, the ability to be able to reflect of dynamic capabilities in your world of work. And so I think for me, it's this ability to identify where does that virtuous cycle sit in, and how do you actually make sure that you're adding value in all of the spaces that you're in. So, what are some of the lessons that I've learned? I've spoken about La Liga as an example. A big component of the success of football teams has been operational excellence.
Interesting. I find a lot of time-back success more pinned to that, offering something quite different and quite innovative. But I was thinking now as to all the things you're learning in these different industries that you're consulting in. What do you think would be the best qualities for graduates coming out of the university now to get into the workspace? What advice would you give them?
We hear about this term, and you've heard it probably many times as well, of VUCA, right? The world is volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. And I often say, so what? We understand that. There's no escape button here. And so how do we respond? And Gert Leonard, who is a brilliant thinker globally, says beautifully that when the world is volatile, you must respond with velocity. You must be faster, you must be quicker, you must be more responsive than anybody in your space. It's what Liverpool does. That's why they win every weekend, right? He says when things
Man City fans would disagree with that.
My son's a Man City fan, and I regret it all the time that I actually introduced him to EPL because I don't hear the end of it, right? He says when things are uncertain as they are, you've got to be unorthodox. You've got to swim against the grain. You've got to do things differently. You might have to look at other industries and learn from them, which is why I'm a big fan and why I've actually set a business around this, to taking people into different environments, because we learn unorthodox. He says when things are complex, you've got to co-create. And co-creation, I think, is a hallmark of how we respond to disruption. Yesterday, I spent some time with some leaders in the agriculture sector. And actually, the future of agriculture sits outside of the industry. It's how do we look at IoT? It's how do we look at AI? It's how do we look at robotics? It's how do we look at drone technology that will in some way change the way in which we do farming and agriculture. Right. And the people I met with are actually outside of the agriculture, but working with them, co-creating solutions matter. And then finally, he says, when things are ambiguous as they are, the A of the VUCA, you've got to be awesome. Yeah. And awesome is the small stuff, right? Yeah. Awesome is how do I come across? How do I position my brand? How do I leave a phenomenal institution like the University of Pretoria and go out and represent my brand? How do I go into a graduate program and actually show up? How do I do beyond what my contract says I must do and actually demonstrate the growth mindset? How do I go into an industry and learn about that industry very differently? And so one of the things I often say is important is for us to go back to what Gert Leonard says. How do you respond to your career with velocity in an unorthodox way, in ways that co-create, and very importantly, in a way that makes things awesome? And then finally, and this is a skill that we don't really speak about, is how do you build the social capital? Yeah, you've been in class with hundreds of people. You walk around this fantastic campus with thousands of people. And I was at a graduation yesterday at UP. It's amazing walking around campus, right? Yeah. But how do you maintain those relationships? How do you keep connected with the individuals? Because for me, it's not just head stuff, right? I always say it's about the head, the heart, and the hand. It's how do I bring these together? And that's some of the stuff that we don't often get told are big factors in success. Who do you surround yourself with? What's your social capital? How do you continue to learn even after you have graduated? Because as I said, we learn every day, right? Yeah. Just coming and having a conversation with you was a learning, right? How am I going to structure this conversation? What are the things that matter? So for me, that's perhaps the one thing I would say to graduates.
Yeah, that's very important. And I like the fact that you were at the University of Pretoria recently for the graduation. Any memories came to mind for you as you're walking past different buildings and as you're going into the reception hall?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is particularly important, and given the history of the country and society that we live in, we've got into an environment where we've got phenomenal educational institutions with great faculty and staff and facilities. And it's actually for me, it's a privilege to go onto campus and to be able to be part of an academic institution, because for me, it's the foundation of the society that we live in. The most successful governments and businesses, if you look at the leaders who run them, if you look at the staff that work there, many of them have got very close links with academia and the university environment. And so for me, a graduation is a special moment. It's a reflection not just of the hour or 2 hours, it's a reflection of your entire upbringing. Because if you think about it, it's the pinnacle of everything from early childhood development to your primary school to high school to having made it to getting into university. But for me, it's more than that, right? It's about saying that getting a qualification from a great institution is a privilege, and how do I make sure that having gone through this privilege, I can pass it on? And so I love spending time with young children and guiding them from a career perspective. I have this unofficial term in terms of being a career guidance counselor. It's not about that. Yeah. It's about just being able to say that I wish I had some of these answers when I wasn't there. I came to Johannesburg without any money for my university fees. I had to go and work a full-time job and study at the same time. Johannesburg was entirely new to me. I just wish there was a bit of a playbook that told me, Abdullah, this is the better way to do it, right? Because I would have done a few things differently. So graduation is the pinnacle of that success. It's the ability to walk down an aisle with all of your friends, with all of the faculty who've been part of the journey with you, with your family who've supported you in this process. People can't afford to get to university. And so it's often friends and family who have to back you up and borrow money to be able to get you there. For me, the important thing is, how do I pay it forward, right? How do I constantly take the privilege and pass it on?
Well, it's been incredible listening to your story and listening to the passion that you have for the work that you're doing, and also listening to just how you're influencing many executive leaders in the work that you're doing. One wonders, just in short, before we wrap it up, what your next 10 years would look like, because it must be very exciting.
There are a few things that are particularly important to me. I spoke about Model UN as a big factor when I missed a day of school. I chair Education Africa, which is the non-governmental organization that took us to the United Nations. And so it actually is full circle, right? 20 odd years later, I am now, chairing the board of this organization that now does work for thousands of kids and has done that for so many years. I remember a few months ago having Kevin Hart coming to South Africa, and we at a school in Orange Farm had over 5,000 learners on the lawn and actually hosted Kevin Hart. And you could see the eyes of these young learners, because they never expected Kevin Hart. They were there for a concert, and all of a sudden Kevin Hart.
Surprise.
And so for me, it comes back full circle, right? So if you ask me what I want to do in 10 years from now, I just want to continue doing what I do. For me, I think if all of us in our small way can understand that it is incredibly powerful for us to be able to be living here now. And Professor Nick Bernadel, the founding dean at Gibbs, often says that the opportunity of a lifetime must be taken in the lifetime of the opportunity. So let's think about the opportunity. We've got a society that we're living in, which has an incredible story that is so much more than the headlines that we read, that's got incredible people, great companies, massive types of brands and individuals that we've been able to create. We live in a continent of more than 1 billion people that's got a young population. We're on the cusp of really taking our rightful place. That place doesn't get taken up by a map, doesn't get taken up by land, it gets taken up by the people, and the people are me and you, right? And part of that is, how do we galvanize all of us as South Africans and broader Africans to say the opportunity is now, and that opportunity is rested on ourselves to be able to take advantage of it. And so for me, 10 years from now, I'd love to do what I'm currently doing.
Incredible. Continued success to you, Abdullah.
A pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on the
Thank you for having me.
LeadUP podcast. That wraps up our conversation. I learned so much just about the work he's doing, but certainly that we have it in our hands, right? We can change the course of our lives, of our businesses, of our countries, just by having the will and the desire and the heart to do it. Certainly catch more of our conversations on the LeadUP podcast at up.ac.za/LeadUP. We're also available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on all platforms. Wherever you consume your podcast content, you'll find us right there. This production is proudly brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations Office. Our head of content is Samantha Castle, and our producer is Alna Schutz, whilst our incredible audio and video quality, which has been produced for you by Maropa Communications. From my side, it's nothing but love and light. Till we meet again, goodbye.